When most people think of serial killers, the same names come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These monsters have become household names, their crimes dissected in countless documentaries and true crime podcasts. But what about the killers who were just as brutal, just as prolific, yet somehow slipped through the cracks of public memory? Today, we're diving into the dark corners of American criminal history to uncover 5 serial killers whose names you've probably never heard, but whose crimes were so horrific they'll haunt you long after this video ends. These aren't just forgotten footnotes in crime history. These are predators who terrorized communities, claimed dozens of lives, and in some cases, operated for decades without being caught. From America's very first documented serial killers who roamed the frontier in the late 1700s, to a methodical engineer who turned murder into a precise science, to an artistic killer who used his talent to lure victims to their deaths. What makes these cases even more chilling is how they reveal the evolution of evil itself, showing us that monsters have always walked among us, adapting their methods to each era while leaving behind trails of unimaginable horror. But here's what's truly disturbing about these cases. And many of these killers could have been stopped much sooner. Some slip through the cracks of broken systems. Others were protected by the very prejudices and blind spots of their time. And in at least one case, an innocent man sat in prison for years while the real killer continued his rampage. These stories don't just chronicle individual acts of evil, they expose the systematic failures that allowed these monsters to thrive. The first killer on our list, it takes us back to a time when America was still finding its identity as a nation. The late 1700s were a period of lawlessness and frontier justice, where entire families could disappear without a trace, and no one would come looking. It was in this chaotic landscape that 2 men began what many criminologists now consider the first documented serial killing spree in American history. Their names were Joshua and William Harper, though they would become known to history as the Harp brothers, and their reign of terror would span over a decade and multiple states. What made the Harp brothers so terrifying wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their complete lack of discrimination in choosing victims and their apparently motiveless brutality. These weren't crimes of passion or even greed. They seemed to kill for the pure pleasure of it, often targeting entire families, including children, showing a level of depravity that shocked even hardened frontier communities accustomed to violence. Their method of filling corpses with stones and dumping them in rivers became their signature, a practice that demonstrated both their calculated approach to disposing of evidence and their complete disregard for human dignity. The Harper brothers' story begins in what is now Orange County, North Carolina, where they were born to Scottish parents sometime before 1770. Micajah, known as Big Harp, was probably born around 1768 as Joshua Harper, while Wiley, called Little Harp, was born around 1770 as William Harper. Their Scottish heritage would prove significant in shaping their destiny, as their family's loyalty to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War would ultimately transform them from settlers into outlaws. Like many Scottish settlers of the American colonies, the Harpers were Calvinists and avowed Tories loyal to the king. This political allegiance would have devastating consequences for the family when the Revolutionary War erupted. According to historical accounts, The Harper family was initially thought to be on the side of the American patriots, but was rebuffed due to their previous associations with British loyalists. The situation escalated to the point where the Harper house was allegedly attacked, the parents lynched, and Joshua and William forced to flee to the woods to hide. This traumatic event appears to have been the catalyst that transformed two young men into the monsters they would become. They reportedly traveled to North Carolina and fell in with a Tory militia group, loyal to Britain but operating more as thugs and murderers than legitimate soldiers. Fleeting glimpses of them appear throughout the war at various battles, including Kings Mountain, Blackstocks, and Cowpens. After Yorktown, when it became clear that the British had lost, the brothers disappeared completely, only to resurface in Tennessee in 1797. It was then that their true reign of infamy began. Their years of lawlessness as irregular militia in a war-torn country had turned them into hardened criminals with no regard for human life. In 1797, the brothers were chased out of Knoxville, Tennessee, because they were caught stealing hogs and horses and accused of something far worse, killing a man, filling his chest with stones, and dumping him in a river. This would become their regular method of disposing of victims, a technique that would later mark them as serial killers. Their killing spree was systematic and brutal. They murdered a farmer named Bradbury, a man named Hardin, and a boy named Coffee in July 1798. Soon, more bodies were discovered, including William Ballard, who had been disemboweled and thrown in the Holston River, James Brassel, who had his throat viciously slashed, and John Tully. The systematic nature of their killings revealed a pattern of extreme violence that went far beyond simple robbery or revenge. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of their crimes was their willingness to murder children, including their own family members. In August 1799, Big Harp bashed his infant daughter's head against a tree because he was annoyed by her constant crying. This would be the only crime for which he would later admit to feeling genuine remorse. When the Harpists were given shelter at the Stagel home in Webster County, they killed an overnight guest named Major William Love, as well as Mrs. Moses Stagel's 4-month-old baby boy, whose throat was slit because he had cried. When Mrs. Stagel discovered them in the act, she screamed, and they murdered her as well. The Stagel murders represented the pinnacle of their cruelty, repaying hospitality with mass murder and showing no mercy, even to infants. By this point, their crimes had escalated beyond local law enforcement capabilities. On April 22nd, in 1799, Kentucky Governor James Garrard issued a government proclamation declaring a $300 reward for their apprehension and delivery to Danville, Kentucky for trial. The bounty placed on their heads reflected both the desperation of authorities and the terror they had instilled in frontier communities. The end came swiftly for Big Harp. In August 1799, he was tracked down and killed by a posse of settlers who had grown tired of waiting for official justice. Little Harp managed to escape and continued his killing spree for several more years. He was finally captured in 1804 while operating under an assumed name as a river pirate. On February 8, 1804, Wiley Harp was executed by hanging, bringing an end to America's first documented serial killing spree. The Harp brothers' case established precedents for how American law enforcement would handle serial killers, including the use of rewards for information, coordinated multi-jurisdictional investigations, and the recognition that some criminals pose threats requiring extraordinary measures to stop. Their reign of terror lasted over a decade and spanned multiple states, making them not just America's first serial killers, but also among its most prolific and geographically wide-ranging murderers. They are believed to have killed at least 39 people and possibly as many as 50 during their bloody rampage across the early American frontier. What makes their story even more chilling is how it reveals that the capacity for systematic, motiveless evil has existed in America since its very founding. The Harp brothers weren't products of modern urban decay or contemporary social problems. They were monsters who emerged from the very heart of early American society, proving that some forms of human evil are timeless and universal. Her physical appearance was striking for a woman of her era, towering at 5 feet 7 inches and weighing over 200 pounds with the muscular build of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. Norway in the 1850s was a harsh place for the poor, and the Storseth family struggled to make ends meet on their small farm. Economic hardship and limited opportunities drove many Norwegians to seek better lives in America, and Belle was no exception. In 1881, at the age of 22, she made the difficult journey across the Atlantic Ocean to Chicago, Illinois, where a large Norwegian immigrant community had already established itself. Upon arriving in America, Belle Storseth quickly adapted to her new environment, but her methods of adaptation would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. She took work as a domestic servant, learning English and observing the customs and weaknesses of American society. It was during this period that she began to understand how the American legal and financial systems could be manipulated for personal gain. Belle possessed an intelligence that was both calculating and patient, qualities that would serve her well in the decades of crime that lay ahead. She studied the people around her, learning their habits and their fears, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. In 1884, Belle married her first husband, Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who worked as a night watchman. The marriage appeared conventional on the surface, but it marked the beginning of Belle's career as a systematic killer. What made Belle particularly dangerous was her ability to present herself as a respectable, hard-working immigrant woman while simultaneously planning and executing elaborate schemes involving insurance fraud and murder. She understood that as a woman, she would be less likely to be suspected of violent crimes, and she used this societal blind spot to her advantage for over 2 decades. The Sorensen marriage produced 4 children, but tragedy seemed to follow the family with suspicious regularity. 2 of the children died in infancy under mysterious circumstances, and both deaths resulted in insurance payouts that Belle collected without arousing immediate suspicion. The deaths were attributed to acute colitis, a common childhood ailment of the era, but the timing and circumstances would later raise questions among investigators. Belle's method was already becoming clear. She would take out life insurance policies on family members and then ensure their deaths appeared natural or accidental. In 1900, Mads Sorensen died suddenly on a day when 2 different life insurance policies overlapped, ensuring that Belle would receive the maximum possible payout. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the symptoms described by Belle to the doctor, convulsions, stomach pain, and difficulty breathing, were consistent with poisoning. The insurance companies paid out without investigation, and Belle found herself a wealthy widow with a proven method for generating income through murder. What made her crimes particularly insidious was her patient approach. She would establish relationships, take out insurance policies, and then wait for the optimal moment to strike, sometimes waiting months or even years. Belle's success with the Sorensen murders emboldened her to expand her operations. She used her insurance money to purchase a large farm property in LaPorte, Indiana, where she would establish what can only be described as a murder factory. The isolated location provided the perfect setting for her crimes, far from the prying eyes of neighbors and law enforcement. The farm became Belle's base of operations, where she would lure victims with promises of marriage, work, or investment opportunities, only to kill them and dispose of their bodies in various locations around the property. In 1902, Belle married Peter Gunness, a widower with 2 young daughters. Peter brought additional life insurance policies into the marriage, and Belle wasted no time in adding him to her list of victims. Less than a year after their wedding, Peter died in what Belle claimed was a tragic accident. A sausage grinder fell from a high shelf and struck him in the head. The coroner ruled it accidental death, but the circumstances were highly suspicious. The sausage grinder was extremely heavy, and the shelf it allegedly fell from was not positioned in a way that would naturally cause such an accident. Belle's story had inconsistencies, but her performance as a grieving widow was convincing enough to avoid serious investigation. With Peter's death, Belle had perfected her technique and was ready to expand her operations on an unprecedented scale. She began placing advertisements in newspapers across the Midwest, targeting lonely immigrant men who had accumulated savings but lacked family connections in America. Her advertisements were carefully crafted to appeal to men seeking marriage and companionship, promising a prosperous farm and a loving wife to the right suitor. The responses to Belle's advertisements poured in from across the country. Lonely men, many of them recent immigrants like herself, saw an opportunity for love, prosperity, and the American dream. Belle would correspond with multiple suitors simultaneously, carefully screening them to identify those with the most money and the fewest family connections who might come looking for them. She was methodical in her selection process, often maintaining correspondence for months before inviting her chosen victims to visit the farm. This extended courtship served multiple purposes. It allowed her to assess their financial worth, ensure they were genuinely isolated, and build trust that would make them more vulnerable when they arrived. When suitors arrived at the LaPorte farm, Belle would welcome them warmly, playing the role of the perfect hostess and potential wife. She would wine and dine her victims, discuss marriage plans, and often convince them to liquidate their assets and bring their money to Indiana for safekeeping. Once the victims had transferred their wealth and were completely vulnerable, Belle would strike. Her preferred method was poisoning, often using strychnine or arsenic mixed into food or drink. The symptoms of these poisons could mimic common illnesses, making detection difficult in an era before sophisticated forensic medicine. After murdering her victims, Belle faced the challenge of disposal, but she had developed an efficient system for this as well. She would dismember the bodies, often with the help of hired farm hands who were told they were butchering livestock. The remains would be buried in various locations around the 48-acre property, scattered in ways that would make discovery less likely. Some body parts were fed to the pigs, while others were buried in the hog pen where the disturbed soil would appear natural. Belle's knowledge of farm operations and animal husbandry served her well in these gruesome tasks. The scope of Belle's operations was staggering. Between 1902 and 1908, dozens of men disappeared after visiting her farm, yet she managed to avoid serious investigation for years. Her success was due to several factors. The victims were typically isolated individuals whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. The rural location provided privacy for her crimes, and Belle's reputation as a respectable widow deflected suspicion. She also carefully managed her interactions with local authorities, presenting herself as a hardworking farmer who was simply unlucky in love. Belle's crimes extended beyond her mail-order murder scheme. She also killed hired farmhands who became suspicious of her activities, and she eliminated anyone who posed a potential threat to her operations. The exact number of her victims may never be known, but investigators eventually identified remains from at least 14 individuals on her property, and the actual count could be much higher. Her methodical approach to murder, combined with her ability to avoid detection for so long, makes her one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The beginning of the end for Belle Gunness came in 1908 when she became involved with Ray Lamphere, a farmhand who had worked for her and knew too much about her activities. Lamphere had helped Belle with various tasks around the farm, including some that involved disposing of evidence from her crimes. Their relationship was complicated, part employer and employee, part romantic involvement, and part criminal conspiracy. When Belle decided that Lamphere had become a liability, she attempted to have him eliminated, but her plan backfired spectacularly. On April 28, 1908, the Gunness farmhouse was destroyed by fire. Inside the burned ruins, investigators found the bodies of Belle's 3 children and a headless female corpse that was initially identified as Belle herself. However, the body was significantly smaller than Belle's known dimensions, and the missing head meant that positive identification was impossible. Ray Lamphere was arrested and charged with arson and murder, but many believed that Belle had staged her own death and escaped with the fortune she had accumulated through years of murder and fraud. The investigation that followed the fire revealed the true scope of Belle's crimes. As investigators excavated the property, they uncovered a horrifying collection of human remains buried throughout the farm. Body parts were found in the hog pen, the chicken yard, and various other locations around the property. Personal effects belonging to missing men were discovered, along with evidence of Belle's extensive correspondence with potential victims. The scale of the carnage shocked even experienced investigators, and the case became a national sensation. Despite extensive investigation and numerous reported sightings, Belle Gunness was never definitively found or captured. The question of whether she died in the fire or escaped to continue her crimes elsewhere remains one of the great, unsolved mysteries of American criminal history. Some investigators believed she had plastic surgery and assumed a new identity, while others thought she fled to Norway or another country where she could start fresh. Reported sightings of Belle continued for decades after the fire, but none were ever confirmed. The legacy of Belle Gunness extends far beyond her individual crimes. Her case highlighted the vulnerabilities of immigrant communities, the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement, and the particular dangers posed by killers who could blend into respectable society. She demonstrated how traditional gender roles and societal expectations could be weaponized by a clever and ruthless criminal. Belle's ability to present herself as a respectable widow while systematically murdering dozens of people showed that evil could hide behind the most conventional facades. The Gunness case also revealed the importance of communication between law enforcement agencies and the need for better systems to track missing persons. Many of Belle's victims might have been saved if there had been better coordination between police departments in different states, or if there had been more systematic tracking of people who responded to matrimonial advertisements. Her crimes contributed to changes in how law enforcement approached cases involving missing persons and interstate criminal activity. Today, Belle Gunness is remembered as one of America's most prolific and successful serial killers, a woman who turned the promise of love and companionship into a death trap for dozens of unsuspecting victims. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters can come in any form, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy. The farmhouse in La Porte may be long gone, but the legend of Hell's Belle continues to fascinate and terrify more than a century after her crimes shocked the nation. These 5 forgotten killers, the Harp brothers, Patrick Kearney, the Doodler, Charles Ray Hatcher, and Belle Gunness, represent different eras and methods of American serial murder, yet they share common threads that make their stories both fascinating and terrifying. Each operated in the shadows of more famous killers, their crimes overlooked or forgotten by popular culture, despite their horrific impact on countless victims and communities. Now we're moving into the 20th century, where serial killing evolved with America itself. The growing urbanization, improved transportation, and expanding anonymity of modern life created new opportunities for predators. One of the most chilling examples of this evolution was Patrick Wayne Kearney, known as the trash bag killer. Unlike the frontier brutality of the Harp brothers, Kearney represented something far more insidious: the methodical, organized killer who could blend seamlessly into society while systematically hunting human beings. Born in 1939 in East Los Angeles, Patrick Kearney seemed destined for an ordinary life. His childhood was stable by most measures: a working-class family, regular schooling, no obvious signs of the monster he would become. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, something dark was taking root. Kearney was small for his age, sickly, and became a target for schoolyard bullies. While most children who face such challenges develop resilience or seek help, Kearney's response was different. He retreated inward, constructing elaborate fantasies where he held all the power. By age 13, these daydreams had crystallized into something far more disturbing: detailed murder fantasies. He would spend hours imagining the process of killing, visualizing every step from selection of victims to disposal of bodies. What makes Kearney's case particularly chilling is how early these homicidal thoughts began and how methodically he planned to act on them. Unlike killers who claim their crimes were spontaneous or driven by uncontrollable urges, Kearney was calculating his future murders while other children were learning multiplication tables. After a brief stint in the Air Force, Kearney found work as an engineer at Hughes Aircraft in California. He was punctual, competent, and completely unremarkable to his colleagues. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring such dark intentions would become Kearney's greatest weapon. In 1962, he committed his first known murder, picking up a 19-year-old hitchhiker and driving him to a remote area near Indio, California. There, Kearney shot the young man in the head and sexually assaulted the corpse. This killing established the pattern he would follow for the next 15 years: methodical selection of vulnerable victims, quick execution with a small caliber pistol, and post-mortem sexual assault. What distinguished Kearney from other serial killers was his remarkable consistency and efficiency. He used the same weapon, a .22 caliber Derringer, and the same methodology for every killing. Most victims were shot while distracted or sleeping, often in the area above the ear where the small bullet would cause maximum brain damage. Kearney wasn't interested in causing suffering. He wanted control and access to bodies for his necrophilic activities. This clinical approach allowed him to kill repeatedly without the emotional escalation that often leads to a serial killer's capture. Kearney's hunting grounds were primarily California's highways and gay bars, where he could find isolated men who might not be immediately missed. During the 1960s and 1970s, homosexuality was still heavily stigmatized, and many gay men lived secretive lives. This social marginalization made them perfect targets for a predator like Kearney. Police investigations into missing gay men were often perfunctory, and families sometimes preferred not to draw attention to their loved one's sexuality. Kearney exploited these social blind spots with ruthless efficiency, knowing that his victims' marginalized status provided him with additional protection from law enforcement scrutiny. The relationship between Kearney and his longtime partner David Hill adds another layer of complexity to this case. Hill lived with Kearney for over a decade, during which time most of the murders occurred. The question of Hill's knowledge or involvement has never been definitively answered, but the pattern of Kearney's killings suggests a strong correlation with the couple's relationship troubles. When Hill would leave, during their frequent arguments, Kearney's killing sprees would intensify. It was as if the abandonment triggered something in Kearney that could only be satisfied through the ultimate act of control: murder. Among Kearney's youngest victims was 5-year-old Ronald Dean Smith, who was playing with a toy truck outside his home in Lenox, California, when Kearney approached him. The killer's willingness to murder children demonstrates the complete absence of normal human empathy or moral boundaries. Ronald wasn't selected because he fit Kearney's usual victim profile. He was simply available and vulnerable. The child's murder shows how Kearney's need for control and domination had evolved beyond his original sexual motivations into something even more disturbing: the pure exercise of power over life and death. Kearney's method of body disposal was as methodical as his killing technique. He would dismember corpses with surgical precision, package the parts in heavy-duty trash bags, and dump them along remote highways and in national forests. This disposal method served multiple purposes. It made victim identification difficult, scattered evidence across multiple jurisdictions, and reflected Kearney's view of his victims as nothing more than garbage to be discarded. The nickname trash bag killer wasn't just descriptive, it revealed the killer's fundamental dehumanization of his victims. The investigation that eventually led to Kearney's capture began with the disappearance of 17-year-old John LeMay, who told a neighbor he was going to visit someone named Dave. When LeMay's dismembered remains were found in the Mojave Desert, police traced the Dave connection back to Kearney. The killer's use of aliases had served him well for years, but this single slip, allowing a victim to mention his name, even incorrectly, created the thread that unraveled his entire operation. When police arrived at Kearney's home, they found no obvious signs of his crimes. The house was neat, smelled clean, and appeared completely normal. Kearney himself was polite and cooperative, showing none of the obvious markers that most people associate with serial killers. This normalcy was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his case, the realization that someone could commit dozens of horrific murders while maintaining such a convincing facade of respectability. Realizing that capture was inevitable, Kearney and Hill fled to Texas. The stress of being fugitives, combined with pressure from their families, eventually led them to surrender to authorities. During his interrogation, Kearney displayed the same methodical approach that had characterized his crimes. He confessed to 28 murders with clinical detachment, providing details about victims, locations, and methods with the precision of someone discussing a technical manual. There was no remorse, no emotional breakdown, just the calm recitation of facts by someone who viewed murder as simply another task to be completed efficiently. To avoid the death penalty, Kearney pleaded guilty to 21 murder charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he remains today at Mule Creek State Prison in California. Unlike many serial killers who crave attention and grant interviews, Kearney has maintained his preference for anonymity. He doesn't speak to researchers, doesn't write letters, and has shown no interest in achieving the notoriety that some killers actively seek. Kearney's case represents the evolution of serial killing in the modern era. Where earlier killers like the Harp brothers operated in lawless frontier conditions, Kearney demonstrated how a methodical predator could exploit the anonymity and mobility of modern urban life. His use of automobiles to expand his hunting territory, his understanding of jurisdictional limitations that hampered police investigations, and his exploitation of social prejudices all mark him as a distinctly 20th century killer. The true scope of Kearney's crimes may never be fully known. His confession included details about victims who were never found, and investigators believe he may have committed additional murders that he never admitted to. Some experts estimate his actual victim count could exceed 40 people, making him one of America's most prolific serial killers, despite his relative obscurity in popular culture. What makes Patrick Kearney's story so disturbing isn't just the number of people he killed, but how easily he moved through society for over 15 years without detection. He held down a responsible job, maintained a long-term relationship, and presented himself as a quiet, unremarkable citizen. His case serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't always the obvious monsters we expect them to be. Sometimes they're the quiet neighbor, the polite coworker, the person who blends so seamlessly into the background that no one ever suspects the horrors they're capable of committing. The methodical nature of Kearney's crimes, his ability to compartmentalize his murderous activities from his daily life, and his exploitation of society's blind spots make him a perfect example of how serial killers adapted to the modern world. Unlike the chaotic violence of earlier eras, Kearney's approach was businesslike, efficient, and terrifyingly successful. He turned murder into a routine, proving that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. From the darkest corners of America's criminal history, we now turn to a case that strikes at the heart of society's most vulnerable, our children. Charles Ray Hatcher represents perhaps the most chilling type of predator, one who systematically targeted children while slipping through the cracks of multiple systems designed to protect society. His story reveals how institutional failures can enable monsters to operate for decades, leaving devastation in their wake. Charles Ray Hatcher was born in 1929 in the small town of Mound City, Missouri, near St. Joseph. From the beginning, his life was marked by violence and neglect. His father, Jesse, was an abusive alcoholic who had served time in prison, and the household was a breeding ground for dysfunction. At school, Hatcher endured constant bullying, becoming an easy target for his classmates' cruelty. Rather than seeking help or withdrawing, young Charles began to retaliate by inflicting pain on other students, displaying early warning signs that would be ignored by every adult in his life. The pattern of Hatcher's early criminal career reveals a system that repeatedly failed to recognize the escalating danger he posed. In 1947, at just 18 years old, he was convicted of auto theft after stealing a logging truck from his employer of only 2 weeks. He received a suspended sentence, the first of many lenient punishments that would allow him to continue his criminal evolution. By 1948, he was back in court for stealing a 1937 Buick, earning him 2 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. But even behind bars, Hatcher was learning and adapting, not reforming. What makes Hatcher's case particularly tragic is the clear escalation pattern that authorities failed to recognize. By 1959, at only 30 years old, he had already served 6 different prison sentences for crimes ranging from auto theft to attempted burglary to check forgery. Each release brought more sophisticated criminal behavior, yet the system continued to treat him as a petty criminal rather than the dangerous predator he was becoming. The warning signs were there, written in black and white across multiple arrest records, but no one connected the dots. The attempted abduction of 16-year-old Stephen Pelham in 1915 marked a crucial turning point in Hatcher's criminal evolution. On June 26th, Hatcher approached the teenage newspaper delivery boy with a butcher knife, attempting to force him into a stolen vehicle. This represented his first documented attempt at violent crime against a young person. Yet even this serious escalation was treated as just another criminal case. Hatcher was sentenced to 5 years under the Habitual Criminal Act, but the focus remained on his pattern of theft rather than his emerging predatory behavior toward children. Prison psychiatrists had multiple opportunities to identify Hatcher as a serious threat to public safety, particularly to children. During his various incarcerations, he was diagnosed with different mental illnesses and disorders, but he never received adequate treatment. The mental health system of the era was woefully unprepared to deal with individuals like Hatcher, who displayed signs of antisocial personality disorder and predatory behavior. Instead of comprehensive treatment and monitoring, he received perfunctory evaluations and was released back into society time and again. When Hatcher confessed to his first murder in 1982, the details revealed the true horror of what the system had unleashed. He claimed his first victim was 12-year-old William Freeman, who disappeared from Antioch, California, on August 27, 1969. According to Hatcher's confession, he had approached the boy, convinced him to come along, took him to a creek, and strangled him. The timing was particularly significant. Freeman disappeared just one day before Hatcher was to be charged with another child molestation case, suggesting that the killer may have been eliminating a potential witness or acting out due to stress from his impending legal troubles. The case of 6-year-old Gilbert Martinez in San Francisco demonstrates how close authorities came to stopping Hatcher's killing spree before it truly began. On August 29, 1969, Martinez was playing with a friend when he walked away with a man who offered him ice cream. A passerby discovered the man beating and sexually assaulting the child and immediately called police. The assailant was arrested and identified himself as Albert Ralph Price, though he carried identification with the name Hobart Prater. FBI records later confirmed this was Charles Ray Hatcher, operating under yet another alias. Despite being caught in the act of violently assaulting a child, Hatcher managed to manipulate the system once again. He was charged with assault with intent to commit sodomy and kidnapping, but somehow continued his predatory behavior for more than a decade afterward. The Martinez case represents one of the most tragic missed opportunities in the entire Hatcher saga. Here was clear evidence of his violent pedophilic behavior, yet he was still able to continue hunting children for years to come. The Eric Criskin case reveals perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of the system's failure to stop Hatcher. In May 1978, 4-year-old Eric disappeared from his home in St. Joseph, Missouri. His body was found on the banks of the Missouri River, showing signs of sexual abuse and suffocation. The investigation that followed was a textbook example of how not to conduct a murder case. Police questioned every known pervert in town before settling on Melvin Reynolds, a 25-year-old with an intellectual disability who had been sexually abused as a child. Reynolds was subjected to months of coercive interrogation techniques that would be considered torture by today's standards. Police used repeated questioning, polygraph tests, hypnosis, and even administered amobarbital, a drug considered a truth serum at the time. This coerced confession, embellished with details fed to him by investigators, was enough to convince a jury to convict him of second-degree murder. Reynolds was sentenced to life imprisonment for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer continued to hunt children. 4 years later, when Hatcher confessed to murdering Eric Criskin, Reynolds was finally released from prison. But those 4 years of wrongful imprisonment represent more than just a miscarriage of justice. They represent 4 more years during which Hatcher was free to kill while an innocent man rotted in prison for his crimes. The case highlights the vulnerability of individuals with intellectual disabilities within the criminal justice system and the dangers of coercive interrogation techniques that can produce false confessions. Michelle Steele became Hatcher's final known victim on July 29, 1982. The 11-year-old was reported missing from St. Joseph, and her uncle found her nude, ravaged body on the bank of the Missouri River the following day. She had been beaten and strangled to death in the same brutal manner as Eric Kriskin 4 years earlier. This time, however, investigators had learned from their mistakes. When Hatcher was arrested the day after Michelle's body was discovered, trying to check himself into the St. Joseph State Hospital, he became the focus of a more thorough investigation. While awaiting trial for Michelle's murder, Hatcher made a confession that stunned even seasoned investigators. He admitted to 15 additional murders dating back to 1969, providing details that only the killer could know. His confession revealed the true scope of his crimes and the systematic nature of his predatory behavior. Hatcher didn't kill in fits of rage or passion. He was a methodical predator who targeted vulnerable children with calculating precision. The geographic scope of Hatcher's crimes reveals how he exploited the limitations of law enforcement coordination in the pre-digital age. His victims were scattered across multiple states, California, Missouri, Illinois, making it difficult for investigators to connect the crimes. He operated under numerous aliases, moved frequently, and targeted children from marginalized communities who might not be reported missing immediately. This mobility and cunning allowed him to evade detection for over a decade while building a victim count that may never be fully known. Even in prison, Hatcher remained a danger to those around him. In 1961, during one of his earlier incarcerations, a fellow inmate was found raped and stabbed to death on the loading dock of the prison kitchen. Hatcher was the only member of the kitchen staff unaccounted for at the time of the murder, suggesting that his violent behavior wasn't limited to his time outside prison walls. He posed a threat to anyone within his reach, regardless of the setting. When Hatcher was finally brought to trial for his crimes, he requested the death penalty, perhaps recognizing that he was beyond redemption or rehabilitation. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. 4 days later, he took the decision out of the state's hands, hanging himself in his cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary. His suicide denied justice to the families of his victims and prevented authorities from potentially learning about additional crimes he may have committed. The case of Charles Ray Hatcher represents a systematic failure across multiple institutions: family, school, criminal justice, and mental health systems all failed to recognize and address the warning signs of a developing predator. His story illustrates how individuals can slip through the cracks of institutional systems, continuing to pose threats to society despite repeated contacts with law enforcement and mental health professionals. The tragedy is that Hatcher's crimes were preventable. The warning signs were there from his earliest interactions with the system, but no one had the training, resources, or institutional framework to recognize what they were dealing with. The victims of Charles Ray Hatcher were among society's most vulnerable: children who trusted adults, who believed in the safety their communities promised to provide. William Freeman, Gilbert Martinez, Eric Kriskin, Michelle Steele, these names represent not just statistics in a criminal case, but young lives cut short by a system that failed to protect them. Their deaths serve as a reminder that the cost of institutional failure is measured not in bureaucratic inefficiency, but in innocent blood. Perhaps most chilling of all is the realization that there may have been other Charles Ray Hatchers operating during the same era, predators who were never caught, never identified, never stopped. The limitations of investigative technology, The lack of coordination between jurisdictions and the inadequate understanding of criminal psychology in the mid 20th century created an environment where predators could operate with relative impunity. Hatcher's case forced law enforcement and mental health professionals to confront uncomfortable truths about their own limitations and the need for better systems to identify and stop dangerous individuals before they can claim innocent victims. The story of Charles Ray Hatcher serves as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind the facade of ordinary criminal behavior, gradually escalating until it reaches unthinkable levels of depravity. Belle Gunness represents a unique and chilling departure from the typical profile of American serial killers. Unlike the male predators who dominated the landscape of murder in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Belle combined the calculating patience of a businesswoman with the ruthless efficiency of a mass murderer. Her story begins not in the criminal underworld or the margins of society, but in the rolling hills of rural Norway, where a young woman named Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth would eventually transform herself into one of America's most prolific and successful serial killers. Born on November 11, 1859, in the small Norwegian town of Selbu, Belle grew up in a world where survival often depended on physical strength and mental toughness. The youngest of 8 children, born to stonemason Paul Pedersen Sturseth and Berit Olsdatter, Belle was raised on a modest farm in Innbygda, Norway. From an early age, she displayed the physical characteristics that would later serve her deadly purposes. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds, she possessed unusual strength for a woman of her era. This imposing physical presence, combined with an apparently keen intelligence, would prove to be a lethal combination when she arrived in America seeking her fortune. Like millions of other Scandinavian immigrants during the late 1800s, Belle made the journey to America in search of better opportunities. She arrived in the United States in 1881, settling initially in Chicago, Illinois, where a large Norwegian immigrant community had already established itself. It was here that she began the process of reinventing herself, changing her name from the distinctly Norwegian Brynhild to the more American-sounding Belle. This transformation was more than cosmetic. It represented the first step in what would become a decades-long career of deception, manipulation, and murder. Belle's criminal career began with what appeared to be a series of tragic accidents and unfortunate circumstances. In 1884, she married fellow Norwegian immigrant Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, and the couple settled into what seemed like a typical immigrant success story. They opened a confectionery shop in Chicago and began building what appeared to be a prosperous life together. However, beneath this facade of domestic bliss, Belle was already displaying the calculating nature that would characterize her later crimes. When their confectionery shop mysteriously burned to the ground in 1896, Belle collected a substantial insurance payout. Rather than viewing this as a devastating setback, she seemed to recognize it as an opportunity, the first indication of her talent for turning tragedy into profit. The pattern that would define Belle's methodology was already becoming clear. She understood that in late 19th century America, a woman could exploit society's assumptions about female helplessness and vulnerability to mask predatory behavior. While law enforcement and society at large were conditioned to view women as potential victims rather than perpetrators, Belle was developing a system that would allow her to kill repeatedly while maintaining the appearance of an unlucky widow struggling against fate. Her success depended not just on her physical strength, but on her ability to manipulate social expectations and exploit the trust of those around her. The death of Mads Sorensen in 1900 marked the beginning of Belle's most active period as a serial killer. Sorensen died suddenly on July 30th, 1900, the day that two life insurance policies overlapped, ensuring that Belle would receive the maximum possible payout. The timing was so convenient that it raised suspicions, but Belle's performance as the grieving widow was convincing enough to deflect serious investigation. She collected the insurance money and began planning her next move, which would take her away from the increasingly watchful eyes of Chicago authorities to the more isolated and less scrutinized environment of rural Indiana. In 1901, Belle purchased a farm in LaPorte, Indiana, a decision that would prove crucial to her ability to continue killing undetected. The 48-acre property provided her with the isolation she needed to dispose of bodies and the respectability that came with being a property-owning widow in a small farming community. Here, she married Peter Gunness, a local widower with two daughters, in April 1902. The marriage appeared to be a perfect match, a widow and widower combining their resources and families to build a new life together. However, Peter Gunness would survive only 8 months of marriage to Belle. Peter's death in December 1902 followed the same pattern that would characterize all of Belle's murders. It appeared to be a tragic accident, but the circumstances were suspicious upon closer examination. According to Belle's account, Peter died when a heavy sausage grinder fell from a high shelf and struck him on the head. The coroner accepted this explanation, despite the fact that the injury pattern was more consistent with a deliberate blow than an accidental fall. Belle once again collected insurance money and assumed the role of the tragic widow, now with 3 children to support and a farm to manage alone. The LaPorte farm became Belle's base of operations for what would become the most systematic and profitable murder spree in American history up to that time. She had perfected a method that combined multiple revenue streams from each victim. First, she would lure men to her farm through matrimonial advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest. These ads painted her as a prosperous widow seeking companionship and partnership, often mentioning her substantial assets and the potential for a comfortable life together. When suitors arrived, they typically brought their life savings with them, intending to invest in their shared future with Belle. Belle's process was methodical and efficient. She would welcome her suitors warmly, playing the role of the lonely widow, grateful for male companionship and protection. She would feed them well, often preparing elaborate meals that showcased her domestic skills and reinforced the image of the ideal wife and homemaker. During these visits, she would encourage them to discuss their finances, learning exactly how much money they had brought and where they kept it. She would also gauge whether they had family members who might come looking for them if they disappeared, preferring victims who were isolated and unlikely to be missed. The actual murders were typically carried out using poison, a method that aligned with the feminine stereotype and was difficult to detect with the forensic techniques available at the time. Belle had apparently educated herself about various toxic substances, developing a preference for strychnine and arsenic, which could be obtained relatively easily and administered without detection when mixed with food or drink. The symptoms of poisoning could be mistaken for various common illnesses, providing Belle with plausible explanations for her suitors' sudden deaths. After poisoning her victims, Belle would dispose of their bodies using the most shocking aspect of her methodology, dismemberment. This was where her unusual physical strength became crucial. Unlike typical female serial killers who relied on poison alone, Belle would butcher her victims' bodies with the same efficiency she might use to process livestock. She would then bury the remains in various locations around her 48-acre property, sometimes in the hog pen where the animals would consume any remaining evidence, and sometimes in carefully concealed graves scattered across the farm. Belle's victim count during her years in LaPorte is estimated to be at least 14 adults and possibly several children, though the exact number may never be known. Her victims included Norwegian immigrants like Andrew Helgelien, who arrived in January 1908 with over $2,000 in cash, and Ole Budsberg, who brought his life savings of $100. Each murder followed the same pattern. The victim would arrive with money and hope, enjoy Belle's hospitality for a few days or weeks, and then simply vanish. Belle would explain their disappearances to neighbors by claiming they had left suddenly for business elsewhere or had decided the arrangement wasn't suitable. The systematic nature of Belle's crimes extended beyond the murders themselves to her careful management of evidence and her manipulation of local authorities. She cultivated relationships with neighbors and local officials, presenting herself as a hard-working widow struggling to maintain her farm and raise her children alone. She was generous with loans and assistance to neighbors, using her murder profits to build goodwill in the community. This investment in her reputation paid dividends when questions arose about her various suitors, as community members were reluctant to suspect someone who had been so helpful and generous. Belle's downfall began with the persistence of Asle Helgelien, whose brother Andrew had disappeared after traveling to LaPorte to meet Belle. Unlike many of Belle's previous victims, Andrew had family members who were both willing and able to investigate his disappearance. When Andrew failed to return or communicate with his family, Asle traveled to LaPorte to search for him. Belle initially told Asle that Andrew had left after a brief visit, but Asle's continued investigation and pressure on local authorities began to unravel Belle's carefully constructed facade. The end came dramatically on April 28, 1908, when Belle's farmhouse was destroyed by fire. The blaze killed Belle's 3 children and apparently Belle herself, whose headless body was found in the ruins. However, the discovery of dismembered human remains buried throughout the property revealed the true extent of Belle's crimes. Investigators eventually found the remains of at least 14 victims, confirming that the farm had been the site of one of the most extensive murder operations in American history. The question of whether Belle actually died in the fire remains one of the most intriguing mysteries in American criminal history. The headless body found in the ruins was significantly smaller than Belle's known dimensions, leading many to speculate that she had staged her own death and escaped with her accumulated wealth. Some investigators believed she had killed a female victim of similar build, placed the body in her bed, and set the fire to cover her escape. Sightings of Belle were reported for decades after the fire, but none were ever confirmed. Belle Gunness's case represents a unique intersection of immigration, gender expectations, and criminal opportunity in early 22nd century America. Her success as a serial killer depended on her ability to exploit societal assumptions about women, immigrants, and rural life. She understood that a woman operating alone on a remote farm could dispose of victims with less scrutiny than would be possible in an urban environment. She also recognized that the Norwegian immigrant community's trust and solidarity could be weaponized to lure victims who felt safe dealing with someone from their homeland. The scale and systematic nature of Belle's crimes challenged contemporary understanding of both female criminality and serial murder. Her combination of traditionally feminine methods, like poisoning, with typically masculine behaviors, like dismemberment, created a criminal profile that didn't fit existing categories. Her business-like approach to murder, treating victims as revenue sources rather than objects of passion or rage, represented a level of cold calculation that shocked investigators and the public alike. Belle's story also highlights the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement and forensic science. The lack of communication between jurisdictions allowed her to operate across state lines without detection. The absence of reliable methods for detecting poison meant that many of her early victims' deaths were accepted as natural. The social isolation of rural communities meant that the disappearance of transient individuals often went unnoticed or uninvestigated. The Belle Gunness case had lasting impacts on American criminal investigation and popular culture. It helped establish the recognition that women could be serial killers and that domestic settings could be sites of systematic murder. Her case contributed to the development of better communication between law enforcement agencies and highlighted the need for more sophisticated forensic techniques. In popular culture, Belle became a figure of both fascination and horror, representing the dark potential hidden beneath the facade of domestic respectability. The mystery surrounding Belle's fate has kept her story alive in American folklore and continues to generate speculation and investigation more than a century after her apparent death. These killers operated in the shadows of American society, but their crimes were no less horrifying than those of their more famous counterparts. Each one found ways to exploit the vulnerabilities of their time and place, turning societal blind spots into hunting grounds. The Doodler case, in particular, reveals how discrimination and fear can literally enable murder to continue unchecked. Now let's turn our attention to another monster who slipped through the cracks of multiple systems designed to protect society. Charles Ray Hatcher represents perhaps the most tragic type of serial killer, one whose crimes could have been prevented if the warning signs hadn't been repeatedly ignored. Charles Ray Hatcher was born in 1929 in Mound City, Missouri, into a world that seemed designed to create monsters. His father, Jesse, was an abusive alcoholic who had served time in prison. The household was chaotic, violent, and devoid of the stability a child needs to develop normally. At school, young Charles became a target for bullies, his small stature and withdrawn nature making him an easy victim. But rather than retreating further into himself, Charles began to retaliate, inflicting pain on other students whenever he could. By age 8, Charles later claimed, he already knew he would kill people. This early onset of homicidal ideation is particularly chilling because it suggests that his desire to murder wasn't triggered by a specific trauma, but rather developed as part of his core personality from childhood. His fantasies were detailed and methodical, revealing a level of premeditation that would later characterize his actual crimes. Hatcher's criminal career began early and followed a predictable pattern of escalation. In 1947, at just 18, he was convicted of auto theft. This was followed by a string of increasingly serious offenses: more auto thefts, burglary, forgery. By 1959, at only 30 years old, he had already served 6 different prison sentences. But it was his attempted abduction of 16-year-old Stephen Pelham that marked a crucial turning point. Hatcher approached the newspaper delivery boy with a butcher knife, attempting to force him into a stolen vehicle. This represented his transition from property crimes to violent crimes against persons, particularly young people. What makes Hatcher's case so frustrating is how many opportunities the system had to stop him before he began killing. He was in and out of prisons and mental hospitals for decades, diagnosed with various disorders, but never receiving adequate treatment. Psychiatrists noted his delusional thinking and paranoia, but he was repeatedly released back into society. Each time he was imprisoned, he seemed to emerge more dangerous than before. Hatcher's first confirmed murder occurred in 1969 when he confessed to abducting 12-year-old William Freeman in Antioch, California. He lured the boy to a creek and strangled him. Just days later, he was caught in the act of sexually assaulting 6-year-old Gilbert Martinez in San Francisco. A passerby found Martinez being beaten and called police, who arrested Hatcher under the false name Albert Ralph Price. Remarkably, Martinez survived the assault, and FBI records later confirmed the attacker's true identity as Charles Ray Hatcher. This case is significant because it represents one of the few times Hatcher was caught in the act of committing a violent crime against a child. Yet somehow, he was still able to continue his predatory behavior for more than a decade afterward. The failure of the system to keep him incarcerated after such a clear demonstration of his danger to children represents a catastrophic breakdown of public safety. For over a decade, Hatcher continued to move through the American criminal justice and mental health systems, leaving a trail of murdered children in his wake. He had a particular preference for young boys, whom he would lure away from playgrounds, bus stops, and neighborhood streets. His method was usually strangulation, quick and efficient, followed by sexual assault of the corpse. One of the most tragic aspects of Hatcher's crimes was the wrongful conviction of Melvin Reynolds for one of his murders. In May 1978, 4-year-old Eric Christian disappeared from his home in St. Joseph, Missouri. His body was found on the banks of the Missouri River, showing signs of sexual abuse and suffocation. Police, under pressure to solve the horrific crime, focused their investigation on Reynolds, a 25-year-old man with an intellectual disability. Over months of interrogation, Reynolds was subjected to polygraph tests, hypnosis, and even drugs that were considered truth serum at the time. He was fed details about the crime and eventually convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to life imprisonment. Reynolds served 4 years for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer, Charles Ray Hatcher, remained free to murder more children. It wasn't until 1982 that the truth finally came out. Hatcher was arrested while trying to check himself into the St. Joseph State Hospital, and he confessed to 16 murders dating back to 1969, including that of Eric Christian. Reynolds was finally released, but the wrongful conviction represents one of the most tragic consequences of Hatcher's crimes. Not only did he murder innocent children, but he allowed an intellectually disabled man to suffer years of imprisonment for his actions. Hatcher's final victim was 11-year-old Michelle Steele, reported missing from St. Joseph on July 29, 1982. Her uncle found her nude, brutalized body on the banks of the Missouri River the next day. She had been beaten and strangled to death. This murder finally led to Hatcher's capture and confession. What makes Hatcher's case particularly disturbing is how the system failed at every level. He had been identified as dangerous decades earlier, yet continued to be released time and again. Mental health professionals diagnosed him with various disorders, but failed to provide effective treatment. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states failed to connect his crimes or share information effectively. The result was that a known predator was allowed to roam freely, killing children across multiple states for over a decade. Even in prison, Hatcher remained dangerous. In 1961, while serving an earlier sentence, a fellow inmate was found raped and stabbed to death on the loading dock of the prison kitchen. Hatcher was the only member of the kitchen staff unaccounted for at the time of death, suggesting that his violent behavior wasn't limited to his time outside prison walls. Charles Ray Hatcher requested the death sentence for his crimes, but was given life imprisonment instead. 4 days later, he made the decision himself, hanging himself in his cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary. His suicide denied justice to the families of his victims and prevented authorities from potentially learning about additional crimes he may have committed. Hatcher's legacy is one of systematic failure. He represents what happens when multiple institutions, family, school, criminal justice, and mental health systems, fail to recognize and address the warning signs of a developing serial killer. His case illustrates how individuals can slip through the cracks of institutional systems, continuing to pose threats to society despite repeated contacts with law enforcement and mental health professionals. The tragedy of Charles Ray Hatcher isn't just the lives he took, but the lives that could have been saved if the system had worked as intended. His case serves as a stark reminder that protecting society's most vulnerable members requires vigilance, coordination, and the willingness to act decisively when dangerous individuals are identified. The children he murdered deserved better. Melvin Reynolds deserved better. The case of Charles Ray Hatcher reveals how a predator can systematically exploit the most vulnerable members of society while repeatedly slipping through the cracks of institutions designed to protect us. His story represents a devastating failure of multiple systems, criminal justice, mental health, and child protection, that allowed him to operate with impunity for over a decade. What makes Hatcher's crimes particularly heartbreaking is the systematic nature of his targeting. He didn't choose victims randomly. Instead, he deliberately sought out children who were alone, vulnerable, or from families who might not immediately report them missing. His method was both calculated and opportunistic. He would approach children in public places, offer them treats or rides, then lure them to isolated locations where he could assault and murder them without witnesses. The tragic case of Melvin Reynolds demonstrates how Hatcher's crimes created ripple effects of injustice that extended far beyond his direct victims. Reynolds, a young man with intellectual disabilities, became a convenient scapegoat for law enforcement, desperate to solve the murder of 4-year-old Eric Christgen. The interrogation techniques used against Reynolds, including drugs, hypnosis, and relentless psychological pressure, represent a dark chapter in American criminal justice. For 4 years, an innocent man sat in prison for a crime committed by Hatcher, while the real killer remained free to claim additional victims. Hatcher's ability to evade capture for so long highlights the challenges law enforcement faced in tracking serial killers who moved between jurisdictions. In the 1970s and early 1980s, communication between different police departments was limited, and there were no centralized databases to track similar crimes across state lines. Hatcher exploited these gaps, moving between Missouri, Illinois, and California, always staying one step ahead of investigators who had no way to connect his crimes across different states. The institutional failures in Hatcher's case are staggering. Despite being diagnosed with various mental illnesses during his numerous prison stays, he never received adequate treatment. Instead, he was repeatedly released back into society, often with his violent tendencies having escalated rather than diminished. Prison psychiatrists recognized his dangerousness, but lacked the authority or resources to provide long-term treatment. The revolving door of the criminal justice system became a mechanism that enabled his crimes rather than preventing them. Hatcher's final confession to 16 murders represents only the tip of the iceberg. Given his decades-long criminal career and his pattern of moving between states, investigators believe he may have been responsible for many more deaths that were never connected to him. Children who disappeared during the 1970s and early 1980s in areas where Hatcher was known to have traveled remain missing to this day, their cases unsolved and their families left without answers. The psychological profile of Hatcher reveals a man who was shaped by childhood trauma but made conscious choices to inflict that trauma on others. His abusive upbringing, while tragic, cannot excuse the systematic way he hunted and killed innocent children. Unlike some serial killers who show signs of mental illness or delusion, Hatcher was methodical and aware of his actions. He knew right from wrong, but chose wrong repeatedly, viewing children as objects to be used and discarded rather than human beings deserving of protection. When Hatcher finally took his own life in prison, he denied justice to the families of his victims and prevented investigators from learning the full extent of his crimes. His suicide was perhaps his final act of control, ensuring that the secrets he carried would die with him. The families of his known victims were left without the closure that might have come from a trial and conviction, while the families of other missing children were left to wonder if Hatcher might have been responsible for their losses as well. The legacy of Charles Ray Hatcher serves as a stark reminder of how predators can exploit systemic weaknesses to claim innocent lives. His case led to improvements in interagency communication, better tracking of repeat offenders, and enhanced protocols for protecting children. However, it also serves as a warning that vigilance is eternal and that protecting society's most vulnerable members requires constant attention and resources. Today, advances in forensic science, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, and better understanding of criminal psychology make it harder for killers like Hatcher to operate undetected. DNA evidence, National crime databases and Amber Alert systems provide tools that investigators in the 1970s could only dream of. Yet the fundamental challenge remains the same: identifying and stopping predators before they can claim more victims. The children who died at Hatcher's hands were robbed not just of their lives, but of all the potential those lives contained. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, each with dreams and futures that were cut short by one man's decision to choose evil over good. Their memory serves as both a tribute to innocence lost and a call to action for all of us to remain vigilant in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Charles Ray Hatcher's story is ultimately one of institutional failure, missed opportunities, and the devastating cost of allowing a predator to slip through the cracks of society. The systematic failures that allowed these killers to operate for so long reveal disturbing patterns in how society handles its most vulnerable members and dangerous predators. The Doodler case exemplifies how discrimination can literally enable murder. 3 survivors of his attacks refused to testify because coming forward would have meant revealing their sexual orientation in an era when such exposure could destroy careers, relationships, and lives. This silence allowed a killer to continue hunting in San Francisco's gay community for over 18 months. The case remains unsolved today, a haunting reminder of how societal prejudice can shield monsters from justice. Charles Ray Hatcher's story demonstrates the catastrophic consequences of institutional failures across multiple systems. Despite numerous arrests, psychiatric evaluations, and prison sentences spanning decades, no one connected the dots between his escalating violent behavior and his obvious danger to children. The wrongful conviction of Melvin Reynolds for Eric Criskin's murder adds another layer of tragedy to this case. Reynolds, an intellectually disabled man, was subjected to coercive interrogation techniques, including drugs and hypnosis, until he confessed to a crime he didn't commit. He spent 4 years in prison for Hatcher's murder while the real killer continued claiming victims. This case highlights how investigations can go tragically wrong when authorities focus on convenient suspects rather than following evidence. The geographic and temporal scope of these crimes reveals how killers could exploit the limitations of law enforcement in different eras. The Harp brothers operated across multiple states during a time when communication between jurisdictions was virtually non-existent. They could commit murders in Kentucky, flee to Tennessee, and start fresh with no fear that their crimes would follow them. Patrick Kearney took advantage of California's sprawling highway system and multiple jurisdictions to dispose of bodies across vast distances, making it nearly impossible for investigators to connect crimes or identify patterns. His methodical approach and use of modern transportation allowed him to claim victims across multiple counties while maintaining his normal life as an engineer. Belle Gunness represents perhaps the most chilling example of how killers can hide in plain sight by exploiting social conventions and expectations. As a widow in rural Indiana, she was seen as a tragic figure deserving of sympathy rather than suspicion. Her multiple insurance claims and the mysterious deaths of her husbands and children should have raised red flags, but social attitudes toward women made it nearly impossible for authorities to conceive of her as a serial killer. Women were viewed as inherently nurturing and incapable of such systematic violence, a blind spot that allowed Gunness to operate for over 2 decades. Her case demonstrates how gender stereotypes can provide perfect camouflage for predators who don't fit expected profiles. The evolution of forensic science and investigative techniques becomes apparent when examining these cases across different time periods. The Harps brothers left behind mutilated bodies and numerous witnesses, but the primitive state of law enforcement in the 1790s meant that coordinated investigations were nearly impossible. By the 1970s, when Kearney and the Doodler were active, police had better communication systems and forensic capabilities, but DNA analysis didn't exist, and psychological profiling was in its infancy. Today, many of these cases might be solved through genetic genealogy, digital forensics, and advanced behavioral analysis, but these killers operated in eras when such tools were unavailable. The targeting of vulnerable populations emerges as a common thread connecting these cases across centuries. The Harp brothers preyed on isolated frontier families who might not be missed for days or weeks. Belle Gunness targeted lonely men seeking companionship through matrimonial advertisements, people whose disappearances might be attributed to wanderlust or starting over elsewhere. Patrick Kearney focused on hitchhikers and young gay men, individuals who were often estranged from families or whose lifestyles made them reluctant to report crimes to police. The Doodler hunted in San Francisco's gay community during an era of widespread discrimination, while Charles Ray Hatcher systematically targeted children, the most vulnerable members of society. These cases also reveal how killers adapt their methods to their environments and available opportunities. The Harp brothers used the lawless frontier to their advantage, knowing that their crimes might go undiscovered for long periods, and that pursuit across state lines was unlikely. Belle Gunness exploited the isolation of rural farming communities and the social conventions that made it acceptable for a widow to have male visitors. Patrick Kearney took advantage of California's car culture and the anonymity of urban life, while the Doodler used his artistic skills to approach victims in a way that seemed harmless and flattering. The psychological profiles of these killers span the spectrum of criminal behavior, from the seemingly motiveless violence of the Harp brothers to the calculated insurance fraud of Belle Gunness. What unites them is their ability to compartmentalize their crimes and maintain facades of normalcy. Patrick Kearney worked as an engineer for Hughes Aircraft while systematically murdering dozens of people. Belle Gunness played the role of grieving widow while poisoning her way through multiple husbands and children. The Doodler used genuine artistic talent to gain victims' trust before leading them to their deaths. The impact of these crimes extends far beyond their immediate victims to terrorize entire communities and change how people live their lives. San Francisco's gay community lived in fear during the Doodler's reign of terror, with men afraid to go to bars alone or accept invitations from strangers. Rural communities in Indiana became suspicious of Belle Gunness long before her crimes were discovered, with neighbors noting the unusual number of men who visited her farm and disappeared. The Harp brothers' crimes contributed to the violent reputation of the American frontier, reinforcing the need for vigilante justice in areas where formal law enforcement was inadequate. These forgotten killers remind us that evil is not confined to any particular era, location, or demographic. The capacity for systematic murder and the ability to hide such crimes in plain sight has existed throughout American history, adapting to changing social conditions and technological capabilities. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations, maintaining vigilant law enforcement, and recognizing that monsters often wear the masks of ordinary citizens. The fact that these killers have largely faded from public memory while others have achieved notoriety raises questions about how we remember and study criminal history. Their cases offer valuable insights into the evolution of criminal behavior, investigative techniques, and social attitudes toward crime and justice. By examining these forgotten monsters, we gain a more complete understanding of the ongoing struggle between those who would prey on the innocent and those who work to protect them. These 5 killers represent different aspects of the same fundamental truth: that evil can flourish in any society that fails to protect its most vulnerable members or recognize the warning signs of dangerous predators. While Belle's early life in Norway had been difficult, it was her arrival in America that would truly unleash the monster within. In 1881, at the age of 22, Brynhild emigrated to the United States, eventually settling in Chicago, where she would change her name to Belle and begin what would become one of the most calculated and profitable killing sprees in American history. Her transformation from Norwegian farm girl to American serial killer represents a chilling example of how the promise of the American dream could be twisted into something nightmarish. Belle's first husband was Mads Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant whom she married in 1884. What appeared to be a typical immigrant marriage was actually the beginning of Belle's systematic exploitation of American institutions, marriage, insurance, and the legal system to build wealth through murder. The couple opened a confectionery shop, but their business venture was short-lived when the building mysteriously burned down. This fire would be the first of many suspicious blazes that seemed to follow Belle wherever she went, each one coincidentally resulting in insurance payouts that improved her financial situation. The pattern of Belle's crimes began to emerge during her marriage to Mads. 2 of their children died under mysterious circumstances, both shortly after Belle had taken out life insurance policies on them. The deaths were attributed to acute colitis, a convenient diagnosis in an era when medical examinations were less thorough and child mortality rates were high. When Mads himself died in 1900, the cause was listed as heart failure, but the timing was suspicious. His death occurred on the one day when 2 life insurance policies overlapped, maximizing Belle's payout. She collected over $80,100, a substantial sum equivalent to well over $200,000 today. Belle's methodology was becoming clear. She would target vulnerable individuals, often recent immigrants or lonely men seeking companionship, gain their trust through marriage or the promise of marriage, take out insurance policies on their lives, and then eliminate them when it became financially advantageous. Her victims were chosen not randomly, but strategically, people whose disappearances would not generate extensive investigations and whose deaths would appear natural or accidental. After moving to La Porte, Indiana in 1901, Belle married Peter Gunness, a widower with 2 young daughters. Peter owned a substantial farm and represented Belle's transition from small-time insurance fraud to large-scale systematic murder for property acquisition. Within a year of their marriage, Peter was dead, allegedly killed when a meat grinder fell from a shelf and struck him in the head. The accident was suspicious. The meat grinder was extremely heavy and would have required significant force to dislodge from its position. But Belle's performance as a grieving widow was convincing enough to avoid serious investigation. With Peter's death, Belle inherited his property and gained access to a perfect killing ground, an isolated farm where she could murder victims and dispose of bodies without detection. She also gained custody of Peter's daughters, one of whom would later disappear under mysterious circumstances, though Belle claimed the child had been sent away to school. The farm became Belle's base of operations for what would become one of the most systematic and profitable serial killing enterprises in American history. Belle's method of attracting victims was as calculating as her murders. She placed personal advertisements in newspapers across the Midwest, particularly targeting Norwegian language publications and Lonely Hearts columns. Her ads painted the picture of a lonely widow seeking companionship and a new husband, often mentioning her substantial property holdings and financial stability. These advertisements were carefully crafted to attract men with money who were isolated from family and friends, the perfect victims for her schemes. The men who responded to Belle's advertisements would be invited to visit her farm in La Porte, often bringing substantial sums of money as evidence of their financial stability and marriage intentions. Belle would welcome them warmly, play the part of the charming widow, and then systematically rob and murder them. Her preferred method was poison, typically strychnine or arsenic, administered in food or drink. Once the victims were dead, Belle would dismember their bodies and bury the remains in various locations around her property, including a pig pen, a chicken coop, and shallow graves in her orchard. What made Belle particularly dangerous was her ability to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously. While murdering suitors for their money, she was also running insurance scams on hired hands and maintaining the facade of a respectable member of the LaPorte community. She attended church regularly, participated in community events, and was known as a successful businesswoman who managed her farm efficiently. This social camouflage allowed her to operate for years without suspicion, even as men continued to arrive at her farm and mysteriously disappear. One of Belle's most disturbing relationships was with Ray Lamphere, a hired hand who became both her lover and accomplice. Lamphere was likely aware of Belle's crimes and may have assisted in disposing of bodies and maintaining the farm's deadly secrets. However, their relationship was volatile and ultimately became Belle's undoing. When Belle attempted to dismiss Lamphere and replace him with another man, Andrew Helgelian, the jealous former employee, became a threat to her operation. The end of Belle's killing spree came in April 1908, when Andrew Helgelian's brother Assel became suspicious about Andrew's disappearance after he had traveled to Indiana to meet Belle. Assel contacted authorities and came to LaPorte to investigate personally. On April 28, 1908, Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground in a mysterious fire. Inside the ruins, investigators found the bodies of Belle's 3 children and a headless female corpse that was initially identified as Belle herself. However, the investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Belle's crimes and raised serious questions about her fate. Assel Helgelian insisted on searching the property for his brother's remains, and what authorities discovered was a charnel house of unimaginable proportions. Buried around the farm were the dismembered remains of at least 40 people, including Andrew Helgelian, whose body was found chopped into pieces and buried in quicklime. The victims represented a cross section of lonely men who had responded to Belle's advertisements over nearly a decade. Some had brought their life savings, others had liquidated businesses or sold property to finance their new lives with Belle. All had met the same fate: murder, dismemberment, and burial on the farm. The identity of the headless female corpse found in the farmhouse became one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. While authorities initially accepted that it was Belle, inconsistencies in the body's size and dental records led many to believe that Belle had staged her own death and escaped. The corpse was significantly smaller than Belle's known physical dimensions, and the convenient absence of the head made positive identification impossible. Many investigators believed Belle had killed another woman, planted the body, and set the fire to cover her escape. Ray Lamphere was arrested and charged with arson and murder in connection with the fire. During his trial, he maintained his innocence regarding Belle's death, but hinted that she might still be alive. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Belle leaving the area around the time of the fire, and there were numerous reported sightings of her across the country in subsequent years. Lamphere was convicted of arson but acquitted of murder, suggesting the jury had doubts about whether Belle was actually dead. The Belle Gunness case highlighted several disturbing aspects of early 20th century American society that enabled her crimes. The isolation of immigrant communities, the limited communication between law enforcement agencies, and the social stigma that prevented thorough investigations into the disappearances of men seeking mail-order brides all contributed to Belle's ability to operate undetected. Her case also demonstrated how traditional gender stereotypes could be exploited by female killers, as Belle's performance of widowhood and maternal grief deflected suspicion from her crimes. Belle's financial success through murder was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest she accumulated over $250,000 through her various schemes, equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. This wealth was generated not just through insurance fraud, but through the systematic robbery of her victims, many of whom brought substantial sums to finance their new lives with her. The scale of her financial crimes was unprecedented for a female criminal of her era. The psychological profile of Belle Gunness reveals a killer who combined the methodical planning typically associated with male serial killers with the poison-based methods traditionally used by female murderers. Her ability to compartmentalize her crimes while maintaining social relationships and community standing demonstrates a level of psychological sophistication that made her exceptionally dangerous. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by psychological compulsion, Belle appeared to be motivated primarily by greed, treating murder as a business enterprise rather than a psychological need. The lasting impact of Belle's crimes extended far beyond her immediate victims. Her case influenced how law enforcement agencies approached missing persons investigations, particularly those involving immigrants and transient populations. It also highlighted the dangers of personal advertisements and mail-order relationships, leading to increased scrutiny of such arrangements. The media coverage of her case helped establish the template for how female serial killers would be portrayed in American popular culture, emphasizing both their domestic facades and their exceptional cruelty. Today, more than a century after her disappearance, Belle Gunness remains one of America's most notorious and mysterious criminals. Her story represents the dark side of the American dream, showing how the opportunities and freedoms of American society could be exploited by those willing to abandon all moral constraints. Whether she died in the fire she likely set or escaped to continue her crimes elsewhere, Belle Gunness stands as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that some monsters are created not by psychological compulsion, but by pure, calculated greed. The horrific reality of these forgotten killers should serve as a stark reminder that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare or warning signs. Instead, it often walks among us quietly, methodically, and with a patience that makes it all the more terrifying. These 5 cases, spanning over 2 centuries of American history, reveal uncomfortable truths about our society's blind spots and the systems designed to protect us. What makes these killers particularly chilling is not just the brutality of their crimes, but how they exploited the vulnerabilities and prejudices of their times. The Harp brothers operated during the lawless frontier era, when authority was scattered and communication was limited. Belle Gunness took advantage of societal expectations about women, using her perceived respectability as a shield for her murderous schemes. Patrick Kearney thrived in the anonymity of modern urban life, using interstate highways and jurisdictional boundaries to evade detection. The Doodler's case was hampered by the social stigma surrounding homosexuality, preventing survivors from coming forward. Charles Ray Hatcher slipped through multiple institutional cracks, highlighting the failures of our criminal justice and mental health systems. These cases also demonstrate how certain populations become vulnerable to predators when society deems them disposable or unworthy of protection. The Harp brothers targeted isolated frontier families. Belle Gunness preyed on lonely immigrant men seeking companionship. Kearney hunted young gay men during an era of widespread discrimination. The Doodler terrorized San Francisco's LGBTQ+ community when being outed could destroy lives. Hatcher systematically targeted children, society's most vulnerable members, while an intellectually disabled man was wrongfully convicted for one of his crimes. The investigation and prosecution of these cases reveal how law enforcement capabilities and societal attitudes have evolved over time. The Harp brothers were hunted by frontier posses and bounty hunters. Belle Gunness may have escaped justice entirely by staging her own death. Kearney was caught through methodical detective work, but operated for over a decade before being apprehended. The Doodler case remains unsolved despite modern forensic techniques and increased reward money. Hatcher's crimes were only fully revealed when he confessed, suggesting many of his victims might never have been connected to him otherwise. Perhaps most disturbing is how these killers were able to maintain facades of normalcy while committing horrific crimes. Belle Gunness was seen as a respectable businesswoman and caring mother. Patrick Kearney held steady employment as an engineer and lived quietly with his partner. Even the Harp brothers initially blended into frontier communities before their true nature was revealed. This ability to compartmentalize their crimes while appearing ordinary to those around them allowed them to operate undetected for extended periods. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal different motivations and methods, yet all share certain characteristics: a complete lack of empathy for their victims, an ability to view other human beings as objects to be used and discarded, and a capacity for extreme violence that they deployed with chilling calculation. Whether driven by greed like Belle Gunness, sexual compulsion like Patrick Kearney, or pure bloodlust like the Harp brothers, they all demonstrated a fundamental disconnection from normal human emotions and moral constraints. These cases also highlight how certain crimes become embedded in popular culture, while others fade into obscurity. The reasons for this selective memory are complex, involving factors like media coverage, geographic location, victim demographics, and the narrative appeal of different cases. The Harpy brothers' story became frontier legend, while Belle Gunness inspired numerous books and films. Yet Patrick Kearney, despite being one of California's most prolific serial killers, remains largely unknown outside of true crime circles. The technological and investigative advances that have occurred since these crimes were committed offer hope that similar killers today might be caught more quickly. DNA analysis, digital forensics, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, and better understanding of criminal psychology all contribute to more effective investigations. However, these same advances also provide new tools for criminals to exploit, creating an ongoing arms race between predators and those who hunt them. The victims of these forgotten killers deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a catalog of horror, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by evil. They were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, people with dreams and fears and hopes for the future. Their deaths represent not just personal tragedies, but losses to their communities and to humanity as a whole. In many cases, entire families were wiped out, severing bloodlines and erasing generations of potential. The legacy of these cases extends beyond their immediate horror to influence how we understand criminal behavior, investigate complex cases, and protect vulnerable populations. They serve as cautionary tales about the importance of vigilance, the need for robust institutions, and the dangers of allowing prejudice and indifference to create blind spots in our society. They remind us that evil is not always obvious, that monsters can wear human faces, and that the price of safety is eternal watchfulness. As we close this examination of America's most evil forgotten serial killers, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that there are likely others, killers whose crimes remain undiscovered, cases that have gone cold, predators who have successfully evaded justice. The darkness that drove William Harper, Belle Gunness, Patrick Kearney, the Doodler, and Charles Ray Hatcher to commit their horrific crimes exists in every generation, in every society, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, vulnerability, and societal blindness to emerge. Their stories serve as a grim reminder that the monsters we fear are not mythical creatures from horror films, but human beings capable of unimaginable cruelty. They walked among us, lived in our communities, and in some cases were our neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances. This is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all, that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic fanfare, but often whispers quietly in the shadows, patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The true horror of these forgotten killers lies not just in what they did, but in the reminder that they represent, that such evil can emerge anywhere, at any time, wearing any face. Their crimes echo across the centuries, a testament to humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and remarkable resilience in the face of absolute evil.